But let's return back to Nigeria, where the country's inflation came in today at a stronger 34.19%, a week before the next meeting of the central bank's monetary policy resetting meeting. In the meantime, some of Nigeria's biggest banks are floating multi-billion offers with attendant impact on trading at the secondary market for shares. Let me take all of this and more to my guest on the show tonight, Johnson Chukwu, the Group CEO at Carry Asset Management. It's quite a very interesting time right now when you look at the economy and the markets. A warm welcome to the show tonight. We appreciate you making it tonight. What's your take on the latest headline inflation reading at 34.19% for June? Let's start from there.
Thank you, Bosin, for having me. My take is that the Nigerian military situation is actually worsening. If you look at an inflation rate of 34.19%, when we were looking at 3.95%, people were complaining. And if you look at the food inflation, which is actually the most difficult aspect of this inflation, you see a food inflation of about 40.87%. But Bosin, further disaggregation of inflation figure shows that food and non-alcoholic items increased by about 17.7%, followed by housing, for water and energy, electricity, at about 5.7%. So, and these are the major components of the consumption of average households in the country. What do average households spend their money on? They spend their money on food, they spend their money on housing, they spend their money on transport. And if you are seeing that consistent increase in those critical consumption category of average Nigerian household, you can also understand why the cost of living crisis we're witnessing today is actually worsening. Of course, nobody had expected anything different. But I was thinking that as we move towards the harvest season, that food inflation will begin to moderate. And because of the base effect, that we should begin to see some level of tapering down of the rate of inflationary increase. But unfortunately, we are still dealing with high cost of energy. We know that price of fuel has increased at the fuel stations. We know the price of diesel is still quite high. But most importantly, we know food prices are still on the rooftop, like Nigerians will say.
So what would this mean for next week's monetary policy meeting of the central bank? Do you think how do you think the central bank, the MPC will decide next week? Would there be a hold? Would there be a hike based on the latest inflation that we have?
Ordinarily, one should expect, if you look at the fact figure, the critical macroeconomic parameters, one would ordinarily think they will tighten. For instance, you did mention that they offered about over $100 million, about $122 million in the market to cool the market, but that didn't achieve any cooling on the pressure of on the naira, which means ideally what the monetary authority should do is to tighten further to moderate the level of liquidity in the economy, and therefore hope that that will calm or reduce the pressure we have on the foreign exchange market. Secondly, we are talking about a further increase in inflation rate to 34.19%, with inflation at 40.87%. The classical economic thinking will be that you need to tighten. But Bosin, we already tightened so much. If you look at the amount of money taken out of the banking system, prior to the last auction of last week, government between the Debt Management Office and the Central Bank withdrawn about 19.98 trillion naira from the economy. Still, it had not dented the inflationary pressure. And the real sector of the economy can't breathe because at interest rates of close to 40%, most manufacturing activities cannot survive. So you're dealing with two contradictory pressures. One, you need to cut down on pressures on exchange rate, and at the same time, you want to moderate the inflation rate. But on the converse, you also have to recognize that the growth, the economic performance of the country is still very weak in terms of economic growth. And the real sector of the economy needs liquidity to be able to sustain the operation. There is very low consumer demand. And then the high cost of the interest cost, the heightened interest cost is also flushing into or fueling further high cost of production. Mm-hmm. So you really have to look at how do I balance these issues. And if I were them, at this point in time, I don't think there's any headroom for further tightening. Because if you tighten further, you may not necessarily succeed in moderating the pressure of food inflation because this is driven by supply bottleneck or shortfall in supply. Two, it has not been able to help us moderate the pressure on the foreign exchange. because those pressures are coming from different variables, coming from injection of liquidity from the FAC allocations. So far, at the end of June, the federal government, the three tiers of government, had actually shared about 5.7 trillion naira in the first 5 months of this year. And that has injected additional pressure on the liquidity in the economy. So the logical thing at this point in time, despite the pressures or despite the logical, classical thinking to say let's tighten further, is to keep rates at the current levels and focus on addressing the pressures that are driving inflation, which is food inflation. We need to address the issue of insecurity. Once we address the issue of insecurity, as well as address the issue of crude oil production, the two things will, one, help us moderate the food inflation, also help us improve the supply of foreign exchange that will help us stabilize the exchange rate.
Let's shift gear and talk about the banks. The banks are back on the markets with recapitalization 20 years on. What do you make of the offers so far on the street?
Boston, if I'm to speak, I would say that this is the worst time for the banks to come to the market, but they did not come to the market out of their own volition. The banks are coming to the market because the central bank came up with a new capital requirement and also excluded their revenue reserve as part of their share capital, and therefore the banks are compelled within the next 2 years to recapitalize to 500 billion naira for banks with international operations, 200 billion naira for those national banks, and 50 billion naira for regional banks. So the banks are coming to the market at a time when we're dealing with cost of living crisis, we're dealing with high inflationary pressure, we're dealing with interest rates on fixed income instruments is quite high, which incentivizes investors to underweight their portfolios in equity and overweight them in fixed income instruments. So ordinarily, they are coming to a time when the incentive to hold equity instruments is not strong. But they have no choice because this recapitalization is induced by regulatory proclamations.
Just on the final note, the earnings season is also here. I'm still trying to get a sense of how the market is trading. Chukwu Power released its earnings last week. Well, what's your take on what you think the psychology of investors play by our playbook will be right now with the earnings coming through?
I think the likes of Chukwu Power, because of their niche market position, remember that for the generation companies, they have the benefit of some of them have actually entered take-or-pay arrangement with the power company. That is the company that is in charge of wheeling power and then distributing power. That's the power holding company. And what is happening is that for them, once you have an assured gas supply, and then you already have an assured market for your power generator, and then the government has increased the tariff for power purchase. So for the likes of Chukwu Power, and those companies that are in what we may call niche market, like the agricultural sector, the upstream oil and gas sector, they will continue to experience or record very good performance. Look at Chukwu Power's performance. From 8 billion net profit after tax to about 20 billion net profit after tax. You saw an increase to over 80 billion in their top line, that is in revenue. And so you saw an increase, a material increase over 130% in their top line, and an increase from 8 billion to 20 billion in their bottom line. So in this consistency in terms of earnings, you see an improvement in earnings and improvement in profitability. So for the likes of such companies that are in niche market where they have an assured market for their final products or their output, and then it's all about, are they able to generate power? So once they gas supply, they generate power and they feed to the bulk trader, and the bulk trader will eventually pay them. Of course, you also, if you look at their balance sheet, you also observe that there's an increase in receivables, which means the time it takes them to collect their billings to the bulk trader is also lengthening, which will have an impact on their cost of fund. But ultimately, companies in the power sector, particularly power generation, and they have an assured gas supply. Maybe they have a gas facility that supplies them power, gas, are in positions to make good profit. Companies in agricultural sector, because there's a huge supply gap, they are making good profit. Companies in the upstream sector that are able to produce, like surplus, they will continue to make profit. But beyond that, the rural sector, those in the consumer goods sector are going to go through difficult. So when we begin to see half-year results of those in the consumer goods sector, we are likely going to see a weakening in earnings because of what I call the cost of living crisis. The average purchasing power of an average household in the country has actually diminished so much. The volume of goods they can afford to consume today have actually halved. If you look at past 1 year, a food inflation at about 40.87% shows that on average, a Nigerian household can only afford about half of what they used to buy in terms of food.
Very interesting time we live in. Great having you on the show as always. Thank you very much for this evening. Johnson Chukwu, the Group CEO at Carrier Asset Management. Have a great evening. Thank you so much as always.